Good day, students. Welcome to class time. I am Lydia Dunn, your home economics teacher for this session. Today we're going to be looking at methods of cooking. So let's begin. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the different methods of cooking and the advantages and disadvantages of each method. So last week, we looked at a KWL chart, and remember, I encouraged you for every single lesson that you do a KWL chart. It is what you know, what you want to know, and what it is that you have learned at the end of the lesson. So you're going to fill out today's topic, which is methods of cooking, what you already know in relation to methods of cooking, what you want to know in relation to methods of cooking, and at the end of the lesson, when you're ready to assess yourself, you're going to look at what it is that you have learned from today's lesson. So let's do a quick recap. So remember last week we looked at types of heat. We looked at conduction, convection, and radiation. So remember that the content that you did last week is a little precursor for what is to come this week, which is methods of cooking. Kind of hinted to that last week. So for the types of heat, conduction, the heat passes from solid to solid. Convection, the heat passes through liquid or air. And radiation, the heat passes from a direct source to the actual item being cooked. And the categories of heat are moist and dry heat. Moist heat is with the addition of some kind of moisture, some liquid or steam. And dry heat is without the addition of moisture or steam. All right, so now we have done that quick recap. Let's get into the lesson. We're going to start with moist heat methods of cooking. And the first one is steaming. Now, if there's one thing I know about Jamaicans, we use the jargons incorrectly. So we're eating steam this, steam that, and we actually have not applied steam to the food that is being cooked. So steaming is a moist method of heat where it is the water vapor or the steam rising from the liquid or whatever liquid the boiling water or whatever liquid it is that is being boiled at the bottom, cooking the food on top. Now, the food may be cooked by direct steam or indirect steam. Now, direct steam is when the steam is coming from the pot of boiling water to the food item, and the indirect steam is when you're using plates. So it's indirectly going, the steam is warming the plate, and then the hot air that we are going to literally get, or the condensation that you're going to get from that hot plate is actually going to cook the food between the two plates. So I have some diagrams here, and this is one type of steaming where we call it tiered steaming. So it has tier, not so much levels, but like steps, one on top of the other. So the bottom pot, the base that we have right here, this is where the liquid would be. Now this is what we would put on the stove top, and this is electrical. All right, so these are, well, for the pot ones, we can see this in the commercial kitchens, and for the electrical one, these are more domesticated. So we'll have this at home. Some persons may have these at homes, but it's not as popular. So what will happen is that what you'll see that one basically fits into the other. So at the bottom of the ones on top of the base, there are holes beneath it, and that's where the steam comes up and cooks the food on top. So with the electric one, you see that it's transparent, and the steam that is coming up cooking vegetables, and this one looks like some rice dish here on top. All right? So the one that is hardest to cook, you put at the bottom, and then the ones that don't take as long of a time to cook, you place it at the top. Another method of steaming, another method of steaming we have is graduated steamer. So for the graduated steamer, you can see on the diagram that it has different grooves. And these grooves, you'll see that they have like they come at different angles. And what this is that it is created this way so it can fit different pots. So if you have a small pot, you can still use your steamer. A medium pot, still use your steamer. And a larger pot, you can still use your steamer. So this particular steamer is made to fit different size pots. Now we're going to look at the advantages and disadvantages of steaming. Now, the loss of nutrients by leaching is reduced as food does not come into direct contact with the food. Now, leaching is when you have the nutrients being left in the water, the liquid that it is being cooked in. So say, for example, you're going to be looking at boiling. You're going to be boiling some vegetables. I want you to look closely. When you're boiling vegetables again, when you're assisting your parents at home and you're boiling vegetables, carrots, beetroots, broccoli, look at the color of the water. Oftentimes, the color of the water is an indication that some amount of nutrients has been transferred into that liquid. And oftentimes, we don't drink the liquid, we discard it. So that is what we refer to as leaching. So where the nutrients leave the food item and it actually goes into the water. And we really don't want that, because when you're cooking, you want to ensure that you preserve or you conserve as much nutrients as is possible, because you're really not eating just for survival. You're eating to live and live a healthy life. All right? So the next one is that foods cooked in this way, it's fairly easy to digest and it has a very light texture. And you'll realize the next one, little attention is required, because you don't want to be opening up the steamer too much to let out the steam that is inside of the pot. You want to allow that steam to cook the food. If you let the steam out, that means it's going to take a longer time to cook, and the cooking texture going to be a little bit uneven. Very seldom fat is used. As a matter of fact, we don't use fat in this method of cooking. The disadvantage, as you can see on your screens, loss of vitamin C, and if it is not removed from the vessel, food is likely to be overcooked. And when it is overcooked, it's very mushy and not very palatable. So let's look at boiling. Now, boiling is when you immerse the food in boiling liquid. Boiling liquid is at 100 degrees Celsius. Please note that you do not put the food item in the pot and then allow it to boil. You boil the liquid before you actually add the food item. And that is to ensure that the food item is being cooked evenly, okay? And you cook it until it becomes tender. Now, suitable foods we use are like muscular cuts of meat, like the legs of the animal or the tail. Rice can also be boiled, egg can be boiled, roots and tubers can be boiled. But I want to spend a little bit time on rice. Now, I have this struggle with my students all the time. Miss, we don't boil rice, we steam rice. And remember I said at the beginning that Jamaicans tend to use a lot of terminologies that are not necessarily accurate. Now, yes, rice can be steamed, but not the way how Jamaicans cook it. When we steam rice, remember I said that steaming is with the water vapor coming up to cook the food item on top. When you steamed rice is normally had in Asian countries, not in the Caribbean. We tend to boil rice because the rice is immersed in a boiling liquid. Once the food item is immersed in boiling liquid and it reaches boiling temperature, 100 degrees Celsius, it is boiling. Because the rice, what happens is that the rice, which is starch, it just absorbs that liquid until it is tender and nice and shelly for consumption. Advantages of boiling. Now, the heat is transferred by convection and it is very rapid and efficient. The food is very unlikely to be burned unless you're not paying attention to your pot and you leave it there for this long period of time and the water just completely dry out. Then you know it is very much likely to be burnt. No fat is used, and this is also a very healthy option. So far we have looked at steaming and boiling, and both of those moist methods of cooking, we don't use fat and they are very healthy options when you're eating. The disadvantages, leaching will definitely occur, which I explained earlier, and some flavor in the meat will be lost. So say, for example, you're going to boil something and then you're not going to eat the liquid, or the liquid is not a part of the meal. All of that flavoring and seasoning that you spend overnight with that meat, you're going to discard it, and it's not going to be as tasty as you would want it to be. Now let's look at poaching. Poaching is another moist method of cooking, and poaching is not a method that we employ a lot in Jamaica. However, I encourage you to do it. It's very easy. It's similar to boiling in that the food is immersed, but the temperature of the water, it does not reach boiling temperature. It's actually on a simmering flame. So that will be about 80 to 85 degrees Celsius. So we allow the water or the liquid that it is being poached in to come to a simmer, light bubbles coming up. And the liquid, it can be wine, milk, or stock. I've actually seen some persons use oil, and but I'm not going to look at that today. But just in case if you see it, it is possible to poach in oil, but I'm not going to address that one today. And so suitable foods, we normally use food items that don't have a lot of connective tissues. So it's quick and easy to cook. And such food items include chicken breast, fish, and eggs. And on this diagram, you'll see here, you see the poaching. This one is the pears. The one to my far left is poaching pears in a nice syrup, poaching egg in water, and this is chicken breast in stock. Advantages and disadvantages of poaching. No fat is used. It's a very healthy option. The food is delicate, it's light, it's really palatable, and it's a fairly quick method of cooking. Some persons, now our Caribbean people, we love tasty, well-seasoned food. I mean, if you are anything like my mother or grandparents, when you go to season food, they say rub it in, and they will enjoy highly seasoned foods. But this, if we use or we are to employ poaching, it's not as seasoned as Caribbean people or Jamaicans like their food items to be. So we may consider it a little bit bland and unattractive. Stewing. Now, stewing is a method that Jamaicans really love to use. I think this method of cooking is the most popular method of cooking in Jamaica. It is a long, slow, moist method of cooking. And the reason why Jamaicans employ this method so much, because we just love gravy. This is the only method of cooking as it relates to the moist method where we serve it with the liquid that it is being cooked in. It is similar to boiling, but the food is cooked below boiling point. So it comes to a simmer, but a little bit higher than that of poaching. So it's right between poaching temperature and boiling temperature. And suitable foods that we use are tough cuts of meat, the stewing hens, and fruits. And on the screen, you will see fruits that is being stewed to my far left, and a nice hearty stew to the right. Now, one thing with stewing, if you were to use stewing or if you use stewing, it is almost a way that you can have a one-pot meal, meaning starch can be stewed with the meat and vegetables can be stewed with the meat. But they're not all going to go in at the same time. So you'd start with the food item that takes the longest to cook, which very often tends to be the protein. Because remember we said we use tough cuts of meat. So once there's some tenderization to that protein, then you will assess it and then you add your starch and your vegetables thereafter. Now, advantages. It is very, very tender when you finish with stewing. It's moist, it's juicy, it's tender, and it's relatively economical to the use of fuel, meaning you don't need too many different pots on the stove. So if you start with the meat, then you add the root vegetables or the ground provision, and then you can add other kinds of vegetable, leafy vegetable or the fruit vegetable, whichever one you want to add to the pot. So all of this, it's relatively economical as you go. The nutrient losses are kept to a minimum as the liquid is served with the meal. And this is exactly what I was talking about earlier, gravies. Jamaicans will love gravies. So because it is in the liquid, we're actually consuming the nutrient as well. It improves the flavor of certain fruits. Some fruits, the skin is very hard, or I wouldn't say hard, but more rough, and we don't really like it. So some persons peel those fruits. I know cashew fruit is one that is stewed very often. Some persons actually stew June plum, and they stew, what's that fruit name again? The bumpy, jackfruit. They will stew jackfruit. Actually, in India and some Indian cultures, in Jamaica too as well, they actually use it as a meat substitute. So they will make curried jackfruits and they will eat it as a meat substitute. I've actually had it and it's very, very delicious. It's a whole meal. A whole meal can be prepared in one pot. And a large variety of stews and casserole can be prepared. Now, you are not in this vacuum or in this box to the different types of stews or casseroles that you can make. It is endless. You can be so creative with this method of cooking. Maybe that's why it's so popular in Jamaica, because in Jamaicans, very often we take our hand, make fashion. Whatever we have at our disposal, that's what we are going to cook and that's what we're going to eat. And it oftentimes is very delicious and we create exciting, vibrant new dishes. So don't be too concerned about sticking to the stewed chicken or the stewed peas or the beef stew. You can create different things. For example, some persons use turkey neck in stewed peas, because it's cheaper. It's a cheaper alternative than the beef and the pig still. So it is, and some persons just use vegetables. So it is endless. One major disadvantage, it takes extremely long. Unless you have a labor-saving device, which is a pressure cooker, to kind of shorten that time, and not everybody knows how to use a pressure cooker well. So some persons just prefer to go through the long process. This method of cooking, you need to start at least 2 hours before meal is actually served. And there is little variation in texture and consistency. So everything tends to be soft. There's no crunch, nothing like that. So everything tends to be one texture. Now we're going to go into dry heat. Now, I know that some of you are saying, I did mention some moist methods of cooking. Remember, that this is just a little snippet of what you can go home and read. Write them down. Remember that KWL chart that we did? Write it down. So if there are things that are not mentioned here, bring it up with the teacher. Go ahead and read for yourself. So we're going to go now into dry heat, baking. Now, baking is the cooking of foods by convection. That's the type of heat transfer that is used. And it is normally done in the oven. Remember, I said that we don't add moisture. So it is generally done without the addition of fat. Some persons, or most persons actually, would put fat just as a base, just so that the food don't burn. So that barrier between the heat and the food item, it just kind of helps it and allows it to reach a temperature that it ought to reach without burning. Fat oftentimes facilitate that. Suitable foods include cakes, pastries, some proteins, breads, and potatoes. And that's just a diagram to show you how we actually go about baking in the oven. And when we go on to the other method of cooking, I'm going to show you a little distinction between baking and the other method that I will mention shortly. So this diagram has baked wings, cupcakes, and baked potatoes. The advantages: very little loss of soluble nutrients. Soluble nutrients tend to be the ones that are soluble in water or fat, because we didn't add that to it, so it's highly unlikely for leaching to occur. The food keeps its shape, it's not distorted, it don't disintegrate, nothing like that. It tends to keep its shape unless you burn it. And then you have to scrape off the burnt parts. And it has a nice crisp brown surface. Now, if you're not careful with baking in terms of managing the time properly, foods, it's a very, very high likelihood of the food drying out. And also, if you So I would advise you, if you're going to use baking, say for example, you want baked chicken for Sunday dinner, bake some potatoes with it. Or if you want stewed chicken, or even whatever the other protein is, if it's not being baked and you're going to use baked potatoes, I would encourage you to bake the protein as well, because it takes a lot of gas and electricity to just bake potatoes. And this is the method of cooking that I mentioned earlier, that I'm going to give you a little distinction. Now, roasting was traditionally carried out over an open fire, with the meat being rotated on a spit. And I'm going to show you a diagram what that is. So today, roasting now is generally done in the oven, or some places still do it on a spit, but it's more commercial. So you'd go to supermarkets and you'll see this. Suitable foods include meats and vegetables. So my diagrams that I have here, the one to my left where you see the whole pig, this is what was traditionally done for roasting. And the spit is that long iron bar that starts at the mouth to the end of the pig. And what happens is that it's actually a mechanical structure. So what happens is that would go around slowly, and it goes around slowly because it's coming into direct contact with the heat. And that is necessary so that it can cook evenly. If you realize on this pig that everything here is nice and evenly browned, so you don't have any burning on any one side. Now the one in the middle is the one that we are most accustomed to. And this is also roasting, and they actually have the spit going right through it. If you go to Mega Mart, High-Low, any of these supermarkets that have a food court, you'll see this device or this equipment here, and it's actually called a rotisserie oven, and we serve it as rotisserie chicken. So it is still employed today, but like I said, it's more on a commercial basis. So the one at the end now, this is what we will do at home. So a roasted chicken, and the pan that it is, it's called a roasting pan. So roasting tend to be larger cuts of meat, or the whole cut of meat. So we tend to roast a whole chicken, we tend to do pot roast, so there are bigger cuts of meat, versus baking, where we kind of joint the item and do it on a small scale portion. Advantages of roasting: so it tenderizes suitable joints of meat, and it develops their flavor. And I want to just kind of elaborate on that a little bit. When you roast, especially over an open flame, smoke is actually a flavoring agent. So when you get that nice smoky flavor, you don't want too much smoke to choke you, or to just where it's just so pronounced that it's actually bitter. That's not what we want. It's just a nice touch of flavor to the food item, and it's a flavoring agent. So that's why most persons tend to like the roasting and the grilling for large cuts of meat, and even small expensive cuts of meat, which I will discuss a little bit later. Little attention is required. Once you set it, you can forget it. I don't know if students will remember this infomercial, set it and forget it. It was a home appliance that you'd put a whole chicken on. So it was like a rotisserie at home, a homemade rotisserie. And the catchphrase was set it and forget it. I don't know, you may be too young to remember that. I don't know if it's still around, but I was a child when I remember that, set it and forget it. So little attention was required. And just like the catchphrase says, you set it and forget it, you affix it to the spit, and even if in your oven, when you're doing the roast chicken, you have to allow it to roast for a particular number of minutes, sometimes even an hour, before you actually go back to it. And fuel can be saved if other items are being cooked in the oven as well. And I think I mentioned that earlier too as well. Moisture loss is high due to high temperatures, so it's something that you need to keep. You don't need to attend to it as often as you would for baking, but there is something that you need to do called basting. So you need to, when it creates its own juices, which is what we call extractives, that is what you're going to use now to kind of just baste it. And basting is literally just putting its own liquid and juices back on top of it to create a seal on top of the item that is being cooked so it doesn't burn. And we tend to baste within the joint areas because those are where the connective tissues are most pronounced. You will see visible shrinking, especially if the food item has some amount of fat on it. Now what happens, and this is just explaining what it is. The fat, when the heat is applied, the fat literally going to melt off the item. And that fat is a very good flavoring agent, which is mixed with the extractives, and that is what we also use to base it. Now the correct jargon for it is that the fat is rendered from the food item. High temperatures may result in the toughening of meat, so you have to also be careful with it that you baste it in the intervals as is required. Grilling is another dry heat method of cooking. Now grilling is the cooking of food by radiation on the gas or electric grill. And the surface, the reason why some persons love grilling so much is that when you put the food item on the grill, the food item is sealed quickly and the flavor is very well developed. And most persons aim to get like these lovely grill marks on food items. The food is moistened with fat, similar to roasting, where the fat is rendered and it moisturizes, it tenderizes the food item. Now, oftentimes, educators and textbook will use grilling and broiling interchangeably. But I want to just tell you one distinction between the two. When you grill, the heat source comes from below. When you broil, the heat source comes from above. So though the method may be similar because of the type of heat that is used, meaning that the type of heat that is used to cook the food item, which is radiation, one comes from below and one comes from above. And that's the distinction between broiling and grilling. And most persons are accustomed in Jamaica, most places have a pan man somewhere around here selling jerk chicken, grilled chicken. So if you notice here on the diagram that this is indeed grilling because the heat source is coming from below, and that grill there on top is creating some nice charcoal grill marks on it. And the advantages of grilling now, it's similar to roasting, very similar to roasting. So it's a quick method. It's a healthy way to cook as the fat drains away from the meat, and when the fat renders, it tenderizes the meat just the same, and the flavor is really well developed. When you grill, you have to ensure that the item is seasoned really well, which oftentimes it is, because, I mean, who don't love a nice rib? And rib is normally grilled. So tender cuts, disadvantages. Tender cuts tend to be very expensive. So grilling, though it is a nice alternative and a healthy alternative, the item to be grilled can be very expensive. And it requires timing and attention to prevent burning. So grilling happens because the temperature is higher and it's direct contact with the heat. You have to pay keen attention to it. And charring, which occurs, is linked to carcinogens. So you have to be mindful of that. That's one disadvantage. So some persons like their grilled items a little bit more charred than the other. So you have to be mindful of that. And now we're going to be looking at combination heat, the combination between dry and moist heat method. So for braising, braising is a combination of dry and heat application. This method uses fat and water. Now, I didn't mention frying before deliberately because I want you to go and do your reading on frying, because we have different categories of frying, so that can take up some time. So go ahead, I challenge you to go ahead and read on the different methods of frying and read upon it for yourself. So this method includes frying, like I said before, and water. So what we do is that we would kind of sear the outside of the item that is being cooked. When we sear it, that is just creating a barrier so that when the liquid is added, it doesn't have to be water only, we can add stock too as well. When that is added, the food item will actually keep its shape when it is being baked or whatever other dry method of cooking is employed. So the surface is browned in small quantity of fat. We tend to kind of shallow fry it. Then the food is slowly cooked in liquid or juices in a covered vessel. And this is an example of roasting. And most of us in Jamaica, we tend to braise food items during the Christmas time, like a nice pot roast beef. We braise it, so kind of sear it, fry it nice on the stove top, and then we finish it in the oven. But that I want to just make this a little bit clear too as well. The vessel that is being used tend oftentimes to be the same vessel that the food item is being fried in. So we tend to use like a nice cast iron pot, a fairly durable, heavy pot that can withstand the high temperatures of the oven. So let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of braising. Lots of flavor is added to the food, and similar to that of stewing, this method, the liquid is also consumed at the end with the protein, and the food retains its shape and has added texture. The texture comes from the searing on the outside, so it creates that little crunch, that hardness, while inside is nice, soft, and juicy. But it is a long method of cooking, and just the same, if you are to sear it for a little bit too long, then just like grilling, if charred too much, it can be linked to carcinogens. So, let's review. We started this lesson with a recapitulation exercise. We recapped what we did last week. We looked at the methods of cooking. We looked at the advantages and disadvantages of each method. Now I'm going to encourage you right now, fill out that KWL chart. What is it that you have learned from this lesson today? Even if it's content that you knew before and you did not put into that column what it is that you know already. Fill out what it is that you learned. Now we're going to look at this review question at the end to just kind of tie the whole lesson together. So the question reads, what methods of cooking are best for someone on a low-fat diet? And you're to give reason for your selection. Before we actually proceed to answer this question, you need to look at some key terms. What methods of cooking, low-fat diet, and give reasons. Every time you approach a question, please underline key terms. It kind of gives you a sense as to how you're going to approach answering your question. When they say what, you know you're listing, you're defining stuff that says lower order. All right, so this is basically recall. This is just recollection. And then now when it says give reasons, you're applying. So you now have application. So you're applying the definition now to what it is that you need to answer. So here we go now. What methods of cooking are best for a person on a low-fat diet? I know I said this right throughout the presentation. Methods of cooking that you use little to no fat, and it's a very good alternative to frying. So, such methods, we started with steaming. Then we mentioned boiling. We also mentioned grilling, poaching. Well, come to think of it, all the methods that we did this morning are good alternatives for a person on a low-fat diet. So you have listed all of those methods now. Give reason for your selection. So what you would do now is look on each method and see, so let's start with steaming. Steaming said that it's the water vapor. It's the water vapor that comes up and actually cook the food. So you're going to go now and explain that with steaming. So in your give reason, steaming is a good alternative because it's the water vapor that is used to cook the food item. Little to no fat is added, or no fat rather is added to the food item. And you will do the same for all the methods that you have listed. All right, remember to justify your answer. Always justify your answer so that you know that you know that you know that you know you are indeed accurate. So that's the time we have for CSEC Home Economics.